Persia, today known as Iran, plays a pivotal role in biblical prophecy, from its origins in Genesis to its future role in the end times. The Bible introduces Persia under its ancient names, Elam and Madai, descendants of Noah's sons, Shem and Japheth. These tribes laid the foundation for one of history's greatest empires, destined for both judgment and redemption. The story of Persia begins in Genesis, where the nation is linked to the descendants of Noah. But Persia's story is not just about its beginnings. It is foreseen in the Bible as both a tool of God's judgment and a vessel for Israel's deliverance. The most notable moment is when King Cyrus of Persia, a pagan king, is specifically named by the prophet Isaiah more than 150 years before his birth. God used Cyrus to defeat Babylon, the empire that destroyed Jerusalem and its temple, and freed the Jewish people from exile, allowing them to rebuild the temple in Jerusalem. Yet, the role of Persia doesn't stop there. In the book of Ezekiel, we learn that in the last days, Persia will be part of a coalition of nations rising against Israel in the war of Gog and Magog. This dark prophecy marks a shift from Persia's role as a redeemer to the rise and fall of Persia reflect a greater divine plan, a plan that spans from ancient times to the end of days, showing that even in the darkest moments, there is always room for you. Throughout biblical history, Persia emerges as both a nation of redemption and judgment. While the Persian Empire's rise signifies the downfall of Babylon, it also marks the beginning of a divine plan that involves liberating Israel and fulfilling prophecy. The book of Isaiah speaks of God raising up a pagan Persian king, Cyrus the Great, to be his chosen instrument of judgment against Babylon. Though Cyrus was an outsider to the Jewish faith, God used him to set Israel free from their 70 years of captivity. Through this unexpected deliverer, the Jews were allowed to return to their homeland and rebuild their temple in Jerusalem. This powerful act of divine intervention through Persia shows how God's plan can unfold in surprising ways, even through pagan nations. But Persia's story doesn't end with redemption. In the prophetic vision of Daniel, Persia's role is foreseen in the rise of two empires, the Medes and Persians, who would overthrow Babylon. In these visions, the Persian Empire is symbolized as a powerful force, but it would ultimately be overtaken by Greece under Alexander the Great. Despite its downfall, Persia's historical and prophetic importance remains undeniable as its actions shape the future of Israel and the broader world. In the last days, Persia will again take center stage in biblical prophecy, specifically in the war of Gog and Magog. As described in Ezekiel, Persia will be part of a coalition of nations rising against Israel. However, even in this moment of judgment, God's promise of restoration remains. As Jeremiah prophesied, God will one day restore Persia, showing that even in the face of judgment, God leaves the door open for redemption. Persia's journey from redeemer to adversary and potential restoration underscores the complexity of God's divine plan for the nations. Persia's story in the Bible is one of profound transformation. From its early days as a nation, Persia's role in God's plan was already set into motion, and the Bible reveals that this great empire would serve both as an instrument of judgment and a source of deliverance. After the destruction of Jerusalem, the Jewish people were taken into Babylonian captivity. But God had a plan. The prophet Isaiah declared that a pagan king, Cyrus of Persia, would be raised up to free the Israelites. This was a pivotal moment in biblical history. Cyrus wasn't just any king. He was chosen by God to fulfill a mission far beyond his own understanding. Through his decree, the Jews were allowed to return to Jerusalem, and the rebuilding of the temple began. This act of divine favor by Persia was prophesied long before it happened, underscoring the idea that God often uses unexpected instruments to carry out his purposes. Yet, the narrative of Persia doesn't stay in the realm of redemption. As Persia's empire grew, it eventually became part of the darker prophecies of the end times. In Ezekiel's vision of Gog and Magog, Persia is listed as one of the nations that will rise against Israel in the final days. This shift from a deliverer to a foe is unsettling, but it reminds us that even nations with significant biblical roles are not exempt from judgment if they turn against God's will. However, there is still hope. In the book of Jeremiah, we read a prophecy of restoration for Persia. Despite its dark future, God promises to restore Persia, showing that even in judgment, there is always room for repentance and divine grace. Persia's connection to biblical prophecy is both profound and intricate, showcasing the nation's journey from a divine instrument of liberation to a key player in the final conflict between good and evil. While Persia's rise is rooted in God's judgment on Babylon, it also played a significant role in the restoration of Israel, especially through the reign of King Cyrus. As the Jewish people languished in exile, God's hand was at work through Cyrus, the Persian king, who was foretold by the prophet Isaiah long before his birth. Cyrus's decree allowed the Israelites to return to their homeland and rebuild the temple in Jerusalem. This moment in history demonstrated how God can use even a pagan king to fulfill his greater purpose, using Persia to deliver his people from captivity and restore their place of worship. But the narrative takes a darker turn when we look at the future role of Persia in biblical prophecy. In the book of Ezekiel, Persia is prophesied to be part of the coalition that will rise against Israel in the final battle of Gog and Magog. In these last days, Persia, along with other nations, will be involved in an unprecedented assault on God's people. This prophecy marks a shift from Persia's previous role as a savior to that of an enemy, illustrating how nations can fall from grace when they turn away from God. Yet, in the midst of these dark predictions, there remains hope. The prophet Jeremiah offers a powerful message. Despite the judgment, God will one day restore Persia. This prophecy of restoration provides a glimmer of hope, showing that even in times of rebellion, God's grace remains available for those who turn back to Him. Throughout the Bible, Persia's role shifts dramatically from an empire used by God to free His people to one involved in the final conflict against Israel. This dual role speaks to the complexity of God's plan, where nations rise and fall according to His will, and the thread of redemption weaves through even the darkest chapters of history. In the Old Testament, Persia's most prominent moment comes with the rise of King Cyrus, as prophesied in Isaiah. God chose Cyrus, a pagan king, to defeat Babylon and free the Israelites from their 70-year captivity. Not only did Cyrus allow the Jews to return to Jerusalem, but he also provided the resources for them to rebuild the temple, fulfilling God's promise of restoration. Through this act, Persia became an unlikely deliverer, fulfilling the prophetic vision of a foreign king who would restore Israel's place in the world. However, Persia's story takes a darker turn in the prophecies of Ezekiel. As the Bible moves toward the end of time, Persia is part of the coalition of nations that will rise up against Israel in the war of Gog and Magog. This alliance, which includes Persia, signifies a dramatic shift in the nation's role. From a deliverer to an adversary, Persia's involvement in the final conflict is a warning that even nations chosen by God are not immune to judgment if they turn against His will. Yet, even in this prophetic judgment, there is hope. Jeremiah's prophecy offers a glimmer of redemption, declaring that in the last days, God will restore Persia. This promise of restoration reminds us that, even in the face of judgment, God's grace and the opportunity for redemption are always available. The story of Persia in the Bible is one of both redemption and judgment, and its role in biblical prophecy is as fascinating as it is complex. Persia's journey begins with God's selection of King Cyrus, a foreign ruler, to deliver Israel from captivity and allow the rebuilding of Jerusalem's temple. This moment in history reveals an important biblical truth. God can use anyone, even a pagan king, to fulfill his divine plans. Cyrus was not only the king of Persia, but also the instrument through which God fulfilled his promise to Israel. Isaiah, more than 150 years before Cyrus was born, prophesied that this Persian king would be the one to set the Jewish people free. This unprecedented moment of redemption showed that Persia, far from being an enemy of Israel, was used by God to bring about the restoration of his people. The Persian Empire became the unexpected agent of God's grace. However, the Bible doesn't just stop at Persia's role as a deliverer. In the book of Ezekiel, the prophecy shifts toward the end times, where Persia will once again take center stage. But this time, Persia will be part of a great coalition of nations that will rise against Israel in the war of Gog and Magog. This dark prophecy speaks to the rise of opposition against God's people in the last days, with Persia standing among the enemies. Yet, in the midst of judgment, God's grace shines through. The book of Jeremiah reveals that Persia will one day be restored. Even in its darkest moments, God promises a future of redemption for this nation. The ultimate destiny of Persia, like all nations, is in God's hands. He promises restoration for those who turn back to him, no matter how far they have fallen. Persia's place in biblical prophecy offers a fascinating journey from its origins as a deliverer to its role in the final days as a key player in the war of Gog and Magog. This narrative reveals much about God's sovereignty over nations and his ability to use them for his divine purposes, no matter how unexpected their roles may be. The rise of Persia, particularly through King Cyrus, was a fulfillment of prophecy. Cyrus, though a pagan king, was chosen by God to conquer Babylon and free the Jewish people from their 70-year exile. God's hand was on Persia, not only allowing the Jews to return to their homeland, but also providing the resources to rebuild the temple in Jerusalem. This act of deliverance from Persia changed the course of Israel's history and fulfilled the promises God made to his people. Yet, as history unfolded, Persia's role in God's plan did not remain static. In Ezekiel's prophecy, Persia is seen as part of an alliance of nations that will rise up against Israel in the final days. This dramatic shift from a nation of redemption to one of judgment reflects the biblical theme that nations can experience both divine favor and divine judgment depending on their alignment with God's will. Despite this, there is a promise of hope in the book of Jeremiah. God promises to restore Persia in the last days, even after it plays a role in the final battle against Israel. This restoration speaks to God's grace, his willingness to offer redemption to even those who have fallen into judgment. It's a reminder that no nation is beyond the reach of God's mercy, and his grace always holds out the possibility of restoration.